What I'm going to do is look at the critical perspectives of a number of critics on the subject of revival and Renaissance. This will necessarily be selective, and there's also a bias towards analysis of the early 20th century Scottish literary Renaissance as opposed to the late 19th century Celtic revival. Any development of this talk into a publication will attempt to join the dots between the various critical perspectives I'll discuss today, but I will try to give a few remarks by way of an argument when I conclude. Before I move on to critics, I'm going to start with a short discussion of Patrick Geddes' essay, The Scots Renaissance, and then look briefly at Hugh McDermid and Edwin Muir, as their respective critical perspectives have been important in how subsequent critics perceive revival and Renaissance. Geddes' article begins with John Stuart Blakey's funeral. The scene represented by Geddes conjures the chant of Ossian over an unreturning hero amid the undying moan of Merlin for a passing world. There is a lament here for mythical and mystical times past, but this shifts as the pipers then play Scots Wha Hae, which for Geddes is the anthem of a renaissant, ever renaissant, unconquerably renaissant people. Renaissance is thus linked by Geddes to the martial words of Burns's poem about Scottish victory at Bannockburn, and suggests a nation that cannot be defeated. Renaissance is revival, but also rising. In both senses, the mystical and the martial, it signifies a refusal of death and a coming back to life. There is in Renaissance a recurring death in life and life in death quality that is expressed by Geddes through what Michael Shaw calls the language of spiritualism, but which also has a soldierly bearing, with the Black Watch playing the pipes. Geddes then introduces Robert Louis Stevenson, calling him the leader of literature to Blackie's leader of nationality. Yet with their passing, new dawn ever comes. Geddes complains that Scotland is losing its traditions, particularly through the Anglicisation of education and the emigration of Scots to England and elsewhere. His argument that Scots continue to celebrate Scottish icons like Burns and Scott, while their educational and cultural traditions are undermined, is similar to the complaints McDermid would make subsequently. The impression Geddes gives of aspects of his contemporary Scotland is of a decadent nation, the native literature supplied with twaddle and garbage in varying proportion. Yet if this is winter, there are also signs of spring in various areas of national life, such as architecture. Geddes believes that his evergreen can, like Ramsay's evergreen of the 18th century, help inspire a new movement, which will add a fresh page to that widely reviving literature of locality that emerged with the Kailyard. Geddes wants a literature that, while national, brings back myth, magic and romance to our desacralised world. Renaissance is an ever-returning past, and Geddes sets the importance of celebrating Scottish myth history against the great monuments of the world. The resurrection of which Geddes writes is not merely cultural, but in mentioning William Wallace, invites the reader to think in terms of political resistance. By the time of McDermid and Muir's Renaissance, the mood is both less nostalgic and less optimistic. Broadly, both men thought Scottish history was a series of catastrophes, especially since the Reformation, which was a particular source of ire for many Renaissance writers. Ultimately, McDermid persisted in his belief that these catastrophes might be overturned or addressed by a recovery of certain cultural modes, such as the Scots language, while Muir would decide that this hope was forlorn. So their diagnosis of the problematics was similar, and as Michael Gardner has suggested, somewhat rests on a leave-aside organicism. But their cure would end up being opposed, the most pertinent breach being Muir's Scott and Scotland, where he renounces the possibility of the Renaissance of Scottish literary culture being founded on the Renaissance of Scots. In any case, the negativity of the Renaissance toward aspects of the Scottish past as well as the culture of its own time, has drawn criticism from contemporary critics, with Cairns Craig describing it as negative nationalism. Part of this involves MacDiarmid's apparent paradoxes. David Goldie, for example, argues that the poet's work represents an uneasy combination of revolutionary and reactionary impulses. However, MacDiarmid himself points to this as a virtue in Albin or Scotland and the Future, one of the key documents of the Renaissance published in 1927, where he calls the movement at once radical and conservative, revolutionary and reactionary. While it's easy to read this as an aspect of MacDiarmid's notorious inconsistencies, it is also a good summary of the contradictory political positions of Scottish nationalism around the time of the foundation of the National Party of Scotland in 1928, contradictions, some might argue, which have never been fully resolved since. This is not to argue that the Renaissance's positionalities can merely be attributed to or paralleled with the political history of the Scottish nationalist movement. For one thing, many Renaissance writers were not political nationalists, and for another, a more necessary reading might now be to examine the Scottish Renaissance alongside other revival movements in relation to a world systems analysis. But such contexts are important to how critics have read the Renaissance and the concept, more generally, of cultural revival. Kurt Wittig's book, The Scottish Tradition in Literature, was published at the height of the second wave of the Renaissance. Wittig's chapter titles indicates his view of the waves and seasonal cycles of the Scottish tradition. First stirrings with Barber, full tide with the Macars, Henryson, Dunbar and Douglas, ebbing with David Lindsay, the Scottish ballads a treasure trove. In the 18th century, there is a surging up of the Scots and Scots Gaelic tradition with Burns and Scott before the backwash of the 19th century, which concludes not with a bang, but a whimper with what Wittig calls the provincial quaintness of the Kailyard. While we are heaving again from Stevenson until World War I, the real breakers come with the Scottish Renaissance, which signifies another potential spring for Scottish literature. A national literature is a sea which ebbs and flows, indicating the recurrence of revival in a broad sense as central to the continuance of the tradition. For Wittig, the trajectory of the Scottish tradition in literature is towards the Renaissance of the early 20th century. Wittig relates this to both the increased focus on the rights of small nations following World War I and the Europeanisation of Scottish literature, which he dates as beginning in this period with Sir Alexander Gray's translations of Heine and German and Danish ballads. However, MacDiarmid was the poet who really put Scottish poetry back on the map of Europe. For Wittig, there is a profound difference of attitude between the contemporary Scots Renaissance inaugurated by Grieve and the vernacular revival of the 18th century with its defensive isolationism. Wittig believes that MacDiarmid has left his indelible mark on Scottish poetry with his efforts alone, and his efforts alone give us the right to speak of a Scots Renaissance. And the Scots of this Renaissance relates in Wittig's mind to the language in particular and MacDiarmid's efforts to revive it for modern literary use. For Wittig, signs of Renaissance are in MacDiarmid's Scots poetry, the increasing confluence, as he sees it, of the Scots and Gaelic traditions, the music of Francis George Scott, MacDiarmid's friend and former schoolteacher, and the emergence of organisations such as the Saltire Society, established in 1936. Wittig describes Edwin Muir as in some respects a descendant of the North Britons of the 18th century for his turning away from Scots and his Europeanness. This relationship between past and present, nation and beyond is key to Wittig's view of the Renaissance and the tradition more generally, in which a recovery of some sort of essential Scottishness is key, even if Wittig rejects inherited racial characteristics as characterising a tradition. David Craig's thesis in Scottish literature and the Scottish people is one of national literary decline, although he does not wholly concur with what he calls the defeatism of John Spear's analysis in the contemporary situation in Scotland. Significantly, George Davies' The Democratic Intellect, also concerned with cultural decline, was published in the same year as Craig's book. Craig is sceptical of the synthetic national ethos proposed by MacDiarmid, wishing instead that the Scots had set to one side their national character in their literature, instead of reading it as a special problem to be solved. While Craig believes that the aim consciously to create a nationhood through literature is relevant to younger countries such as America, in Scotland the truly national age was well and truly past by the time of the Renaissance. For Craig, the prevalence of emigration in Scottish life, especially in the mid-19th century, was partly responsible for a break or pause in the literary tradition, when, from 1825 to 1880, there is next to nothing worth attention. And emigration also fostered a homesick nostalgia in many literary figures, most notably Stevenson. In this, Craig is aligned with MacDiarmid's view of the Scottish 19th century as a period of dearth, with the Renaissance, certainly for MacDiarmid, as a route to a non-sentimental national rootedness in culture. And yet, Craig points to Gibbon's A Scots Quair as highly characteristic of the émigré nostalgia he laments, marked especially in Chris Guthrie's close identification with the land, which is marred by a plangent emotion. According to Craig, it is a mark of the uncertain foothold for a national literature in Scotland that this weak ground for nostalgia should crop up in so many places. Emigration of our most notable talents thus creates gaps in the imaginative records of the country and tempts our writers into indulgence of their weaker sides. In Craig's terms, which ignore Chris's mythic role as Scotland, Chris Caledonia, the possibility of national revival or renaissance is undermined by the very conditions that have forced Scottish writers to leave Scotland in the first place. The poet George Bruce, who was a producer at the BBC, edited the 1968 collection, The Scottish Literary Revival. The opening line of the introduction is highly MacDiarmidian. It is now generally agreed that no Scottish poetry of great consequence was produced between the death of Burns in 1796 and 1922. This is very much a founding claim of MacDiarmid's Renaissance, a scorched earth literary history that disappears Scott, Hogg and Stevenson, along with Lady Nairn, Robert Tannahill, James B.V. Thompson and many other poets, and in which history restarts with MacDiarmid. 1922 was the year in which MacDiarmid first appeared in print in the Scottish chapbook with the semi-dramatic sketch Nisbet, an interlude in post-war Glasgow, in the first edition of August 1922, while The Watergaw was published in the magazine's third edition of October 1922. The revival for Bruce starts with MacDiarmid, who is given the most poems, although the anthology works chronologically by birth date, opening with Pittenbury MacGillivray and Marion Angus, born in 1856 and 1866 respectively. Angus is one of only 2 women included out of 38 poets, the other being Helen Cruikshank. Notable also is a title implying a revival stretching beyond the modernist Renaissance that lasts throughout the 20th century and which sees Scottish literature emerge from the prospect of being little more than, quote, a degenerate thrums of sentimental Kailyardism, one of the key aims of the Renaissance. Literary revival focused solely on poetry is, since 1922, a perpetual recurrence, meaning the Renaissance lasts beyond its historical moment and remains dominant in 20th century Scottish literary culture. Renaissance spawns a permanent revival. Francis Russell Hart, in the Scottish novel From Smollett to Spark, discusses the Renaissance in the context of a more recent increased interest in Scottish nationalism, especially the economic case for such, alongside a longer-term crisis of national confidence and mass emigration. Writing only a year before the Scottish devolution referendum of 1979, his book was published in the year of Scotland's ill-fated Football World Cup in Argentina, 1978. He makes an explicit link between the politics of economic nationalism and literary renaissance in the 1920s, claiming that what is now a call for economic renaissance began as a celebration of literary renaissance half a century ago. Hart's focus on the novel is important in emphasising that the Renaissance was not solely the purview of poetry and debates over language choice, and his range of novelists is greater than the typical focus on Gibbon and Gunn. Although Gunn, to whose memory the book is dedicated, gets his own chapter as a Highland novelist, and Gibbon is noted for his brilliant adaptations of language in A Scots Quair, Hart also includes William Edwin Muir, George Blake, Compton Mackenzie, Eric Linklater, James Burke, and Sidney Goodsir Smith as novelists of Renaissance, although there are notable absences such as Nan Shepherd. Hart sees the Renaissance of the 1920s as constituting a reawakened nationalism, for him a hopeful sign, and a neo-Calvinist response to the Kailyard. While Hart points to the 1960s and early 1970s as a period in which the literature of Scotland was separated from political activism, most notably in the novels of Muriel Spark, he makes the speculative point that the economic crisis of contemporary Britain casts in shadow the question of what Scottish federalist independence may do for the renewal of a literary tradition long grounded in elegy and exile. Hart's assessment on the future of the novel in Scotland is somewhat reliant on political configurations, and he also assumes cultural survival is at stake, although he believes a more measured and balanced view of the situation than the swinging polarities of Renaissance views of Scottish history is the best approach. Robert Crawford, in Devolving English Literature, compares MacDiarmid's Renaissance to Ezra Pound's wished-for American Renaissance as examples of modernist provincialism. Crawford reclaims the term provincial, which not only describes a geographical location out with the metropolitan culture, but implies a non-derogatory positionality that, with exceptions such as T.S. Eliot notwithstanding, has no wish to assimilate to a mainstream position. Although the proposition that America is provincial in this period may be stretching the term beyond usefulness. Crawford relates Scottish Renaissance to magazine culture. MacDiarmid's start when Still Grieve in the New Age in 1909 and greater contributions in the 1920s align him with Pound again, as well as with a post-war era of cultural change across Europe and in America, although Crawford also notes the influence of Geddes' Ramsay-influenced Evergreen. However, Crawford's chapter on modernism is really an attempt to infiltrate Scottish writers such as MacDiarmid and Lewis Grassic Gibbon in the sphere of a very male-dominated modernist canon that includes Eliot, Pound and Joyce, but which Crawford reads as being every bit as outside Anglo-normative models as that of the Scots. The common link is the demotic energies of these modernists. Crawford argues that in aiming to outflank the Anglo-centricity of established Englishness through a combination of the demotic and the multicultural, modernism was an essentially provincial phenomenon, although by using the term provincial, he doesn't explain the links or discrepancies between modernism and Renaissance. Gerard Carruthers, in Scottish literature, identifies the pessimism that was central to the Renaissance as informing the key Scottish criticism of the 20th century, which he terms generalist Scottish criticism, defined as attempts to describe the continuity or lack of this in the Scottish literary tradition in a way that is concerned with an overdetermined or over-anxious sense of tradition. Carruthers argues that the racialist Celticism made popular by Matthew Arnold would inform the essentialization and psychologization central to this journalist line of criticism. This is fundamental for Carruthers to G. Gregory Scott's Caledonian Antizyzology, from Scottish Literature, Character and Influence, published in 1919, a book and a concept that would influence MacDiarmid, but also informs influential work by John Spears, Kurt Wittig, David Craig, and David Deitch's The Paradox of Scottish Culture, published in 1964. For Carruthers, the flaw common to all these critics' work is the idealization of a complete or organic cultural holism that reads periods of Scottish literary history as broken or lacking in comparison with the apparent continuities of the traditions of larger countries. Such apparent fragmentation breeds revival or renaissance, but this for Carruthers is based on a fundamental misreading of the multiplicities of literary traditions, whereas a less pessimistic and nation-centric assessment would dispense with the eternal revivals into which Scottish literature has been locked. Marjorie McCulloch in Scottish Modernism and its Contexts, 1918 to 1959, attempts to define the similarities and differences between a Scottish modernism and the Scottish Renaissance. One of McCulloch's main aims is to resituate the Scottish revival of the post-1918 period in the context of the Anglophone and European modernism of the early 20th century. While definitions and ideas of modernism have been expanding, McCulloch is concerned that this still does not include discussion and analysis of Scottish modernism and its key players. So in one sense, McCulloch wishes to make a contribution to modernist studies by advocating for a Scottish component. However, another aim of her book is to move away from what McCulloch describes as the existing limited and potentially inward-looking idea of an interwar Scottish Renaissance movement to include its international significance as a Scottish manifestation of modernism. For McCulloch, Scottish modernism is not entirely synonymous with what we have become used to calling the Scottish Renaissance, although it is closely related to it. While for McCulloch, many protagonists of the Scottish Renaissance were supportive of initiatives towards a new Scotland, they weren't all modernists. She mentions the likes of Helen Cruikshank, F. Murray McNeill, and even John Buchan. Her study focuses on those she considers to be modernists, like MacDiarmid, the Muirs, Grasset Gibbon, Gunn, and various female writers such as Catherine Carswell. Nan Shepherd, again, gets short shrift. Some of whom, like Gibbon for instance, weren't especially supportive of Renaissance. One danger here is that revival or Renaissance becomes conflated with modernism in a way that is unhelpful in understanding either phenomenon. Another danger is that the Scottish non-modernists of the period will slip further from critical view as modernism continues to expand its critical precedence over more popular or non-canonical writers and forms. Cairns Craig in The Wealth of the Nation discusses revivalism in positive terms as the foundation to Scotland's acquisition and accumulation of cultural capital, an attempt to wrest from forgetfulness the memory of the nation which seemed, by the Union of 1707, to have consigned to oblivion its cultural past. He cites many examples of revivalism from Macpherson's Ossian to the collecting of songs by Burns and Scott, and includes Geddes' Renaissance and MacDiarmid's Renaissance. They all, for Craig, sought to build a bridge between the culture of the past and that of the present, and in a fashion similar to the religious revivalisms of the 18th century, sought to infuse the present with the virtues of the past. For Craig, revivalism is part of keeping alive what he calls Scotland's spiritual empire, which is the continuance of the nation's cultural traditions in the face of political change, and as a response to the defeat for independence in the 2014 referendum. But while Craig mentions the Scottish literary renaissance of the 1920s as part of the history of Scottish revivalism, he at the same time sees that renaissance as profoundly damaging to the nation's sense of itself in its attempted erasure of aspects of the Scottish past, a phenomenon he describes as exemplifying nostophobia, a sickness with home or an emotional revulsion from the homeland, which sees the Scottish tradition as diseased and the radical cultural historical surgery performed by the Renaissance as the cure. As such, according to Craig, the so-called Scottish Renaissance became in effect the gravedigger of the Scottish past, devaluing the cultural capital which the country had built up through the 18th and 19th centuries. This declinist perspective was perpetuated in Scottish criticism after the Second World War, even by those critics, such as David Craig, who were not in sympathy with the aims of the Renaissance. The irony is that negative appraisals of the Renaissance, such as that by Craig, enact many of the same problems of which the Renaissance is accused, and as I have argued elsewhere, the Renaissance needs to be read within the wider terms of modernist narratives of decline, rather than solely those of apparent Scottish decline. Michael Shaw's book, The Fin de Siècle Scottish Revival, concentrates on the Celtic revival of the late Victorian period. It examines various different aspects of the revival, the Romance revival, the influence of the Belgian revival, and the Japonisme on the Scottish revival, neo-paganism and the occult, the revival of pageantry. Shaw's approach is internationalist while also analysing the national context in which the Celtic revival operated in relation to constitutional matters. And while there is no chapter dedicated to Ireland, this country's revival is a persistent comparator throughout the book. He is also interested in forms other than the literary, such as visual art, reminding us that the revival manifested across various cultural forms. His book is at once a vital contribution to Scottish studies, while also deepening our understanding of the Fin de Siècle from the perspective of the Celtic margins. A few main points emerge. First, Shaw insists on the links between the Celtic revival and the later Scottish literary renaissance, thus cutting against MacDiarmid's severing of these potential ties as a basis for his renaissance. As Shaw argues, by recovering Scotland's Fin de Siècle, we not only grasp the complexities of constitutional and cultural tensions in the United Kingdom around the 1890s and uncover Scottish contributions to several European literary and artistic developments, but also advance our understanding of Scottish modernism. Second, that alongside an attention to political issues such as constitutional reform, the Celtic revival was, like its Irish cousin, concerned with spiritual matters, especially spirituality's alternative to the Christian tradition. Third, that the Celtic revival was in many ways, and following on from the previous point, an anti-stadialist cultural movement that set itself against the teleologies of mainstream progress and materialism. One question not addressed by Shaw is what the relationship might be between the Celtic revival's anti-stadialism, and this is true too of the Scottish Renaissance, and the recurrent nature of revival renaissance in modern Scottish literary culture, as well as how we might now think about Enlightenment in light of the centrality of revival to a stadialist perspective. Much contemporary criticism has inherited the perspectives of Tom Nairn, who essentially considered the Renaissance to be a belated flower or thistle-like weed of a thwarted romantic nationalism. Nairn, in Old and New Scottish nationalism, sees the Renaissance as in large measure a response to the pathologies of national culture, with MacDiarmid's A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle being that great national poem on the impossibility of nationalism in a stateless, nationalism-less nation. Nairn's analysis in many ways confirms the Renaissance's pathologisation of Scottish literature and history, in the process pathologising the Renaissance itself. Writing of what he calls MacDiarmid's symbolic emigration into the cosmic universalism of A Drunk Man as escape from the kilt-yard, Nairn, ventriloquising grief from annals of the five senses, insists that one is driven towards the totality, the general balance of things, because the particular balance of things in one's country is so intolerable, because its schizophrenia threatens cancellation to nonentity. Nairn's hostility to the tartan monster of Scottish kitsch is indebted to MacDiarmid, but the antisyzygy in Nairn's analysis has ceased to be productive, and Renaissance is a stillbirth rather than a rebirth. As Scott Hames argues, Scottish literary studies tends to reproduce Scottish distinction and cultural capital on terms compatible with the claim of right of the political class. In this close relationship between Scottish literature and the politics of independence, the concept of revival has played an important, if somewhat opaque, role. And while literary and cultural revival in the broadest sense is not exactly synonymous with specific moments or movements such as the Celtic Revival or the Scottish Literary Renaissance, it has a close enough kinship to bear a family resemblance. The ever-recurrence of revival in 20th century Scottish literature may be canny marketing, but it is also related to the political journey towards devolution and a hope for independence that were also factors in the specific revivals of our period. Relating to this, most, not all, but most of the critics I have mentioned in this very potted critical history are concerned with the revival's effect on the cultural health of the literary tradition, even if they have, or believe they have, transcended the discourse of pathologization. If revival and Renaissance are caught, as I would argue, in the ineluctable alliance of decline and rebirth, so too in some measure are critical responses to revival and Renaissance. To emerge from this may require a more global and comparative critical perspective.